Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for watching with us, joining us today. Should be a great discussion. We're going to be talking about Canada's battle in Sicily, and we're going to be covering lots of areas, not just the Navy or Army or Air Force, all of it. So I'm excited for the guest today. We got Alex Fitzgerald-Black, who knows tons about this stuff. Really good insights on this thing. So I'm really excited for that.
All right, Brad. Yeah. I'm really excited to be here and chatting about Operation Husky and the Canadian role.
Yeah, so we were just chatting a little bit before, but we've got some kind of areas we want to cover. But if there's always questions, comments, please keep them coming. We'll always try to get to everything we can and talk whatever we want. We got a bit of a structure, but we can throw that out the window because it's my show and I can do whatever I want. So, Alex, why don't you take it away? Why don't you give us a little bit of background first?
Yeah, so I guess it's important to realize Operation Husky occurs, 78 years ago today, July 9th and 10th, 9th for some of the airborne operations, 1943. And that means, we're almost 4 years into the war by this point. So what the heck has gone on for 4 years? Well, there's certainly been a big fight in North Africa that's been going on since 1940, a very back and forth struggle. 1942 in the fall, you have the Second Battle of El Alamein, and that kind of finally pushes Rommel back and gets him on in the retreat. You have the landings in North Africa with Operation Torch, in which the Royal Canadian Navy played a significant role, especially corvettes doing escort work. Yep. Landing a pretty, at that time, I think that was the largest amphibious operation to that point in history, landing a British and American army on those shores. And the idea, you're going to kind of squeeze the Germans in North Africa, and a whole bunch of stuff goes right, a whole bunch of stuff doesn't go as well as it perhaps could have. But at the end of the day, you end up with the Germans in particular building up a big bridgehead in Tunisia. Rommel's Rommel's Africa Corps, later an army, falls back on Tunisia. And there's actually a big buildup. Before kind of Tunisia, the Italians actually played the largest role in the North African campaign, which is generally unknown. We all talk about Rommel in the Africa Corps, but really the Africa Corps was kind of a small, really heavily mobile force that assisted the Italians for a couple of years. And then in Tunisia, things change a bit, and the Germans really inject a lot of materiel, a lot of air power into that. And that actually cost them in the end. There's a lot of people like hand-wringing over why it took them so long to take Tunisia, which fell in, early mid-May 1943. But basically, the Germans lost something like 2,400 aircraft in 6 months in the Mediterranean theater, basically because of Operation Torch and the fighting in North Africa and the fighting in Tunisia. And approximately 250,000 troops, Italian and German, surrender in Tunisia in May 1943, which is actually a larger surrender than what happened at Stalingrad. Now, the Stalingrad battle is ultimately much larger, but nevertheless, significant casualties. And the Germans and the Italians, they managed to get some forces away, mainly by air, but the Mediterranean is a really great geographic feature for the Allies, who dominate the sea by this point, and managed to cut off most of the German and Italian escape. While that's all going on, after the invasion of North Africa, you have the Casablanca Conference, which happens in Casablanca, Morocco, in January of 1943. And this is when basically all the bigwigs, Churchill, no Stalin, he's a bit busy with the fighting on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Stalingrad's raging in the winter of 1943 there. Yep. They all get together and decide, okay, what are we going to do in Europe, for 1943, essentially? What's the plan? And there's a whole bunch of options that are thrown around. Really, the Americans don't come very well prepared for this with good options. They, and they're kind of divided as well. Admiral King, the U.S. Navy's chief, wants a lot of resources to focus on the Pacific, for instance. The air chiefs, the American Air Force, they really want to do things in Europe but they can't, build things up in the UK quite as quickly as they maybe want to. And so, doing something in the Mediterranean may make some sense for them because they can send these assets. Air assets are relatively flexible. They can kind of be sent from one, maybe not Pacific to the Atlantic, but from Europe to the Mediterranean, relatively easily.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, they kind of decide, well, the British convince I don't know how much they convince the Americans, but they certainly make a good argument that it's not yet time in 1943 to start the second front. And I really mean second front in air quotes because, North Africa was a second front. The air war was a second front, the Battle of the Atlantic, what have you. It's just not time for that. We don't have theoretically they could have the lift that they needed for D-Day in 1943, but they would have had to take it from the Pacific, for instance, and not do as much there and that sort of thing. So they're working with finite resources, right? And American factories are starting to churn out stuff in big numbers. The Battle of the Atlantic is still not quite, it's not really won in the spring of 1943, but it's won to the point where the Germans really can't recover, and the Allies can relatively speaking guarantee that they're going to get 90% of the stuff they want from A to B.
Right.
And so there's still a lot of things going on. They decide, well, no, what we got to do is instead of going back into kind of Northwest Europe in 43, we need to do things that are going to help the Soviets, help on the Eastern Front, and continue to erode German the ability for the Germans to wage war in general. And so what they decide is, well, let's do something in the Mediterranean. A couple of options exist. There's Sardinia is kind of one that's put forward. Sardinia is kind of too small, though.
Again, give me a second. I'll pull up the.
Get some comments
for something else, but no, the screen here.
Oh yeah, the map might
it's a bit on there. I'll go with it. We'll go with it.
So Sardinia, which is top left of that map and kind of half of it's cut off there, it's an option, but it's kind of too small. There's not enough of an Axis garrison there. It would really just be a British operation, for instance. And that's not good enough because the Americans need to be seen to be fighting. There's political implications here.
Right.
Sicily, on the other hand, does a lot of good things for you. There's a sizable Italian garrison there, Italian naval bases, lots of air bases there that are already developed and in use by the Axis air forces to especially to resupply Tunisia. This was a resupply base for Tunisia and for North Africa earlier in the war. And it's a spot where they've been bombing Malta from, since 1940, the Italians and then the Germans as well. And so if you can take that away from the Germans and the Italians, that gives you a potential base to attack, somewhere else in the central Mediterranean, in mainland Italy, for instance. It'll help secure your sea lanes through the Mediterranean, which means that, your convoys no longer have to go around the Cape of Good Hope, which saves you a whole bunch of shipping and a whole bunch of time. There's kind of hopes that maybe it'll get Turkey into the war. That they kind of always hope that they can get Turkey into the war.
Which doesn't happen, of course.
And it hopefully will knock Italy out of the war. They're really hopeful that an attack on this is Italian sovereign territory. It's not an Italian colony. It's part of the Italian state. If we can knock Italy out of the war, well, maybe that means the Germans have to defend Southern Europe by themselves, and that could draw in German reinforcements to this theater that can't fight on the Eastern Front, that can't reinforce the situation in France. And so that's the judgment that's made. And at the end of the day, the Allies agree to do this operation in Sicily in kind of the summer of 1943. They're kind of not sure at first because they have to figure out when Tunisia is all gonna wrap up, because some of the forces that are being used in North Africa are going to be used here. But nevertheless, that's kind of the judgment that's made. There's kind of a handshake agreement made here at Casablanca as well around, if we do Sicily in 43, we're doing D-Day, Normandy. Well, it turns out to be Normandy in 43. And so the Americans get that concession out of the British. At the same time, there's a bunch of other things that happen at Casablanca. I mean, there's the Casablanca Declaration, which is essentially Unconditional surrender is what the Allies are looking for out of the Germans in particular, but the Axis more generally, i.e. there's no terms. You just surrender and submit to the terms that we impose, which is controversial, but probably I don't think it should be really. I mean, the Germans were always going to probably fight to the finish. That's in hindsight,
Of course.
But that's the reality. The Air Forces are reorganized and centralized under Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder at that point, who we can talk about a little bit later. Yeah, lots going on at Casablanca. It's quite the conference, quite the important milestone in the Second World War.
Yeah, definitely one that sets the tone, and obviously, like you just said, the strategy and direction for so much of the war. But yeah, for our purposes, we'll just focus on the Sicily decision and then to attack Italy.
Yeah, and important to understand, I guess, that Sicily does not necessarily mean Italy's going to happen. The agreement isn't made for the mainland Italy, I think, until I think it might be the Quebec conference, but it's during the Operation Husky operation where they actually decide, and they decided there because Sicily is going so well. So anyway, we can chat about that later. But
yeah, we'll talk about that later. But yeah,
I'm just going to grab a drink here.
Yeah, take your time.
So the map you'll see on your screen here, this is actually a lovely reproduction done by Mike Bechtold of one of the maps in Roskill in the Royal Navy's official history. And you can kind of follow the different routes of the convoys. You've got in green the American convoy routes, and you've got the British convoy routes in red. You'll see there's a couple of convoys that actually come from the States or from the UK for this operation. So you've got the American line. I think that comes directly from the States. And then you've got the red line, which is the British or Canadian line. The Canadian convoy would be involved with that. As many of you will know, and we talked a little bit about the Battle of the Atlantic. The Battle of the Mediterranean is also ongoing in terms of, there is some U-boat presence. There is some Italian submarine presence as well. And on, I think it's the 4th of July, 1943, I believe it's a U-boat torpedoes 3 vessels carrying Canadian troops and equipment. And that has a significant impact on how the campaign unfolds for the Canadians. I believe 58 are killed. The 1st Canadian Division, which is the one that's slated to land in southeastern Sicily, loses about half of its motorized transport. I think they lose something close to 40 guns, 17 pounders, 25 pounders, anti-aircraft guns as well, 40 in total. And so that, limits. Now, the force does land, 1st Division does land, just like kind of on D-Day in 1944, up artillery, right? They've got extra firepower added. They've got British, especially mobile artillery units that are on, M7 Priest, tracked vehicles for mobility purposes. But, that's generally speaking, the convoys arrive fairly unscathed other than that incident. The German Air Force and the Italian Air Force kind of try to intervene a little bit, but they really aren't able to kind of do much. They actually attack a couple of convoys, but really don't do any damage. They try to attack some of the ports in Tunisia that the Allies have recently captured. But at this point, the German Air Force isn't a bit tough. They are getting reinforced significantly, though. They're sending, I think, something like a quarter of single-engine fighter strength is sent to this theater from German factories in the spring of 1943. And so they are trying to use the Air Force to buttress their defensive position in the central Mediterranean. They try to do some similar stuff with their bomber force, but a lot of the bomber crews at this point are actually, there's one report I remember reading, they captured a shot down German Luftwaffe bomber crew. And the guy, I guess the interrogation report found that a lot of the crews that they were sending to the Mediterranean, they had to operate at night, really, because they didn't have air superiority at all. Right. And a lot of the crews weren't experienced and weren't well trained in night flying. And so a lot of them were actually being sent back to Germany because they just weren't useful. Yeah. So there's an interesting air battle that develops here as well. So people may wonder, and this is an interesting thing that kind of comes up, how big was Operation Husky compared to, Operation Overlord, Operation Neptune? A lot of people say, the blanket statement is, well, D-Day, Operation Neptune is the largest amphibious operation in history.
Yeah.
Depends on what you're counting and how you're counting, right? So you can absolutely say that D-Day in 1944 was the largest combined air, sea, and land operation in history. There is no, and the reason for that is primarily because of the naval support and the air support. There's about 12,000 aircraft, and about 6,000 or so warships, landing craft, supply ships, etc., for D-Day. For this operation, there's only about 2,600 warships, landing craft, that sort of thing. So just short of about half of what they have for D-Day. Yet they're actually landing, in terms of airborne and seaborne troops on the first day, 160,000 troops in Sicily. Now, if you compare that to Normandy in the first day, it's 156,000. So they beat it by just a couple of thousand there. So in that way, you can consider this the largest single-day amphibious operation ever, if you want to go by number of troops landed on the first day. The Battle of Okinawa is another one to talk about with regards to this number. It is ultimately probably the biggest amphibious operation in history, but it took place over multiple days. So it depends on how you want to do your statistical analysis. Really.
Yeah, it's always going to be a topic of debate, obviously, of what counts, what doesn't. But yeah, like we say, Okinawa is literally the largest number because the war in Europe was winding up, or was over. Yeah, it was, or just winding up when it started. So all these naval assets could be shifted to focus on one particularly, not very large island, but difficult island to take. Yeah.
But certainly in July of 1943, Operation Husky at the time was the largest combined air-sea land operation ever attempted. Led by Dwight Eisenhower, who would also lead and make some of the same decisions on D-Day. Yeah, absolutely. Many fewer airborne. Yeah, you're right, Sheldrake. That's absolutely true. There are far more seaborne landed troops in Husky because they weren't using full airborne divisions here. They were using kind of a parachute regiment in the case of the Americans, and then pieces of. And there's other airborne operations that take place in subsequent days for Husky that bring in the balance of those forces. And so it's a really cool campaign. There's a lot going on. I mean,
it's like there's a lot to keep track of. I mean. We can hear just from the naval, elements to the stuff once we get to the fighting on land, and then we'll talk about the Air Force later. But it's just there are a lot of threads and strings to follow here, and how you do that is depending on what you want to do. But we'll try our best. But there's a lot going on.
Well, and I don't know about any other campaign, and someone out there can maybe correct me. There's very few campaigns out there where two airborne forces arrive and engage each other. And in Husky, this happens. The enemy force opposing the Allies at the start is, there's a whole bunch of Italian coastal divisions, which are coastal militia, just meant to be there to kind of, be a tripwire, essentially. There are 4 regular Italian divisions that are fairly motorized as well. And then there are, at the start, 2 German divisions, the Hermann Göring division, which is kind of a weird panzer division that's kind of based around the Luftwaffe. And you have the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. And added shortly thereafter is the 1st Fallschirmjäger or Parachute Division. The Germans actually land them around Catania, which is around the same spot where the only spot where both sides jump into battle.
Yeah.
You have, German parachute troops landing, German airborne transports bringing them in to the airfields around Catania, while the British have jumped in a bunch of troops and landed a bunch of glider troops south of Catania to help the British advance in that sector. Yeah. So quite a fascinating subject.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to move forward here?
Yeah, let's move forward. I guess we got to start talking about the Canadians a bit more.
Yeah, I guess we should. As I say, Yeah, so if you want to talk about the landing, that would be
awesome. So the Canadians, it's interesting. The Canadians are given this task because they asked for it. Basically, the Canadian Army's been sitting back in the UK, and other than Dieppe and some other small kind of raids that don't really see any real activity, they're sitting there training, twiddling their thumbs, not doing a whole lot. And that's really annoying a lot of people at home. If you're, in English Canada in particular, and you have this proud tradition of the Canadian Army in the First World War, and the Canadian Army isn't doing much, 4 years into the Second World War almost. So lots of pressure. The Canadians kind of insist that they be included. And so a British division's taken out of the order of battle, a Canadian division's put in. Mm-hmm. They don't have a whole lot of time to train because they basically have like 2 months or something by the time old and when they actually show up in Sicily. They've been training in Scotland, and they come in their convoy. But anyway, they're given kind of the easiest, what's assumed to be the easiest sector to land in, which is in kind of almost on the southmost eastern tip of Sicily, the Pachino Peninsula. And there's a 51st Highland Division on their right. They also have a special service brigade on their left to assist them. They land. They take some casualties. Their main objectives are basically there's a few coastal guns that they need to capture, Italian coastal guns, and there's a significant airfield at Pachino. That's actually not in use at the time. It's actually been plowed up by the Italians. But they capture that airfield. The Royal Canadian Regiment actually plays a significant role in capturing that airfield, and they take a couple of casualties. And there's a sprinkling of casualties on that first day. But for the most part, they're encountering, the militia, the Italian coastal units that for the most part don't really want to fight, don't really put up a lot of resistance, and generally speaking, are relatively easily overcome. Interestingly enough, the RCR captured that airfield, and I believe the first aircraft to land on that airfield, once it was fixed in, because the Canadians were followed by engineers to help fix the airfield up. It was used as an emergency strip for the Spitfires operating in Malta, and a Canadian, George Noel Keith, who becomes an ace or is an ace during this battle. He actually comes in and has to land because I think he runs low on gas. After some dogfights above the bridgehead, he gets some gas and takes off and heads back to Malta. But it's a relatively easy fight in this part of the engagement. And the next step is really the Canadians are supposed to be there to cover British 8th Army's left flank as they drive north through Catania. And if you want to go, I know you have another map in there, but like I think it's towards the end of the Army part of the deck, with the entire map of where all the landings are. But I wanted to address the landings out in the American sector for a brief moment.
Yeah, 1 second. Let me see if I can.
No problem. I know it's well in there.
Everyone knows what you're looking at here.
All right. So, Bark Force, and then you have 1st Canadian Division in the bottom right there. And then in the middle, at the bottom, you have the U.S. 7th Army under George Patton coming ashore. And they meet a fairly significant German and Italian counterattack. And by the way, you have to be careful with the Italians in this campaign, because yes, there are those that decide they're going to, throw down their weapons and surrender pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. But there's also some regular army units here that actually fight quite well. Mm-hmm. And I think it's the Livorno Division and the Hermann Göring Panzer Division actually make significant counterattacks against the American beaches in particular in this area. 1st Division at Dime, Jela there, they fight off a pretty significant attack. And that's kind of where the Germans are concentrated. And if you want to go back out to the overall map here, there's basically 2 major counterattack forces. One is in the center of the island, and that's where the Hermann Göring and Livorno divisions are. In the west of the island, up towards even west of Palermo, there out towards that 20 July number there. In that area, there are 2 regular Italian divisions and one the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, and so they're outflanked by these landings entirely. Which is we could talk it for days about the planning for this operation. I actually think the planning ended up with the right plan at the end of the day. And this is one of the reasons for it, because those divisions are absolutely useless out there for the first, 4 or 5 days. Now they have to work their way back. And so what ends up happening is the Americans are heavily counterattacked, where I was talking about earlier. The British are kind of moving towards Catania in the north. And we know the Allied intelligence knows that the Germans are all in the center and east of the or west of the island, pretty much. And so they're like, well, this is a real opportunity. Maybe we can cut them off. So Montgomery actually gives a road to the Canadians, and it's the road that red line follows through southern Sicily. And they take that road away from the Americans. And the real reason he did it on the 13th of July was because the Americans were facing, the heaviest of the counterattacks. And so the Canadians were supposed to go around the flank and get behind them and cut them off. Unfortunately, a couple days hence, the Germans have decided they're not going to stand in, unlike in Normandy where they stand and fight everywhere. Yeah. They decided, we're going to stand and fight in Sicily, but we're going to stand and fight in the kind of northeastern part of the island. We're going to establish a defensive line basically from San Stefano in the north to Leonforte Asoro in the south, and then across to Catania, across the Titania River Valley, and basically a big L. And they're in the process of withdrawing. The Canadians, quote unquote, steal the road at Montgomery's insistence. Yeah. And Americans are pissed off, but the Americans are already starting to move to the west because they've got to kind of, they want to get to Palermo because they want a logistical base. They need to liberate the rest of the island. And by liberate, that's a bit of a weird term here because most of the locals felt they were liberated. They didn't really like Mussolini all that much, but this is enemy territory, right? These are enemy civilians technically, right? And so there's a bit of a weird, weird situation that way. But anyway, this is why the Canadians end up all of a sudden, they were going to be relegated to a very secondary role early on in the campaign. Yep. And it ended up turning into they're suddenly playing kind of the central role of the campaign, along with to their left the first U.S. Infantry Division, because what ends up happening is someone just mentioned I'll just continue my thought and we can talk about the march across Sicily. The Germans decide they're going to hold this L. The British are stopped in the Catania Plain. And it's not a very good spot to attack. Lots of river crossings to make, very open terrain. The quick advance to Messina is just not going to happen. Yep. And where is Montgomery able to attack? Well, it's with the Canadians, on the left-hand side of the line. And the Americans are kind of out of it for a week because they're busy, advancing to Palermo and taking a whole bunch of terrain, but not fighting a whole lot of enemy. Mm-hmm. And so it's really 1st Canadian Division and 1st U.S. Division in the center of the island that have to start punching at basically the inland hinge where that L meets of that line. And Alexander decides the road issue. Yes. For sure. And a lot of people don't, they think he didn't, many times in this campaign, they think he was too loose and he wasn't forceful enough. Commanders like Patton, telling him to, letting him kind of get away with, skirting around orders, sometimes that sort of thing. But Alexander was, I think that, he's maybe not a great operational commander, but he's certainly a competent, high level operational or strategic commander, I think. And he did I think, a reasonable job. But we have a comment about the motor transport at sea, and it certainly slowed up their initial advance. If you want to bring up some of those photos you have, Brad, the march across especially southern Sicily. It is so. Like I said earlier, they lost half the division's motor transport and a whole bunch of guns, which did have impacts on the fire support that could be rendered. But at the same time, there was a lot of British units helping out, and so I don't think the Canadians lacked for any fire support. But they certainly had to kind of hoof it for a long ways across the island.
Speaking of which, because you set me up there, where is it? Well, literally hoof it.
Well, and I guess here's the thing: it's a semi myth that they march across the entire island. Like, look, at the end of the day, a fully motorized British or Commonwealth division doesn't have a whole lot of motor transport compared to, say, a fully motorized American division. So not everybody's going to get, what they usually do is they have the collection of troop carrying vehicles, and whenever they're leading an advance, they give those guys the troop carrying vehicles and they go ahead and use them, right? So, but there's other issues with Sicily too. I mean, even if you have motor vehicles, in some cases, they just can't go everywhere.
Right.
You know, the tracked, Bren gun carriers can't get off the road in certain spaces. So you kind of need things like these, the donkeys here to get yourself, to get your ammunition, to get your supplies to the front line, because the front lines are happening, around large mountain areas. I have to say, most of the shortages made up about halfway through the campaign. Sheldrake's absolutely correct.
That's true.
These are RCRs, the two images that you've shown. First one in the kind of the mountain pass was the Pioneer platoon, the support company. And then this one, you have the Pioneer platoon, with their mules getting some water in. This is actually in Regalbuto, which is even later in the campaign. So even when they get that motor transport capability back, they still have to use these means of transportation because, they're necessary in this environment, right?
Right. I mean, sorry, just to jump in there, but I'm sure we have people watching who have been there, right? And it's still, I haven't been there myself, but I'm a bit of a travel show junkie, but especially with Italy. But it's still difficult to get around. So it's interesting, and I'm sure lots of people who are watching can speak to that. Yeah,
and there was some issues. I think Montgomery, when he first kind of came to see the Canadians, it was very early in the campaign.
Yeah,
he was very critical of them because I think they were kind of worn out from the first few days of marching, on foot across, and they were not used to this weather, right? They were training in Scotland. I've been to Sicily in the summer and in July, and it is hot and it is dry and it sucks to be walking really anywhere. For a long period of time. So, I really, I guess I get Montgomery's, criticism there, but, it took them some time to kind of, get used to the conditions. But once they did, and he was very impressed with the Canadians by the end of the campaign. And we'll get into what that was, but.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back here with, you were speaking of Montgomery, and I can't not because you sent me the photo, but the inclusion of everyone's favorite Canadian general coming firmly in cheek. But yeah, so obviously this is a bit of a set up propaganda shot, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about Guy Simmons a little bit, not too long. He gets a bad rap, but some of it is deserved. But anyway, your opinion might be different.
Simmons is interesting. He wasn't originally supposed to command 1st Division in Sicily. General Salmon was supposed to do that, but he was killed in an air crash when he was actually coming. I think he was going to Egypt or something, somewhere in the Middle East or the Mediterranean to do the planning for Operation Husky.
Yep.
And so, Simmons is tapped, and he's this young,
Mm-hmm.
commander who's very, very capable as a staff officer for sure.
Yep.
Next to him there is to the left on my screen, at least, so the officer also looking at the camera. That's George Kitching, his GSO-1 head staff officer for 1st Division, and they're kind of good friends, which is going to be tested later in the war.
Yeah, a little,
but they form a pretty good team here. I guess early on, one of the things to understand about Sicily is it's a lot of for the first, good chunk of the campaign, where the Canadians are kind of they're pursuing a retreating enemy force that's kind of slowly backing up and everything. And they're doing a lot of field craft. They're doing a lot of trying to outflank the enemy, stuff like at Valguanera and places like that. Simmons doesn't have a lot of control over the battle, right? It's a very mobile battle, very much send the guys into the hills to outflank the enemy, and it's more managed kind of perhaps at the brigade level, I guess, and the guns in particular, while useful in those stages, are not necessarily as heavily concentrated as they will be, as they will need to be in the kind of middle and later stages of the campaign. And Simmons comes under a lot of fire for basically the first kind of assaults towards Ajira.
Right, which we'll get to,
Victoria Ridge, essentially. He creates these kind of artillery based plans that a lot of, senior officers, battalion commanders and that sort of thing, criticized for being very inflexible. You need to, how am I supposed to get my battalion to closely follow on the heels of a creeping barrage when we have to climb a cliff and fight the enemy at the same time, right? Yeah. And so you kind of get and understand that, but at the same time, he did need to instill some kind of form of concentrated effort in those battles, because the Germans were starting to fortify their lines. And this is kind of after the Asoro and Leonforte battles, where the Germans are now backed into a point where this is where they actually intend to hold. Yeah. And they don't want to give things away. And so Simmons, tries to come up with these, fairly, sophisticated, not much flexibility artillery plans, which sometimes don't really work. But at the same time, you can build some flexibility into things, but it's understandable why, everybody wants the most guns as possible firing in support of them when they're moving in advance, right? So there's certainly some positives and negatives to both angles there.
Yeah, so here's a question. I'm sure you can see it, Alex, but I think this is a good one, to be honest. I'd be interested in kind of what you have to think, what you have to say.
That's an interesting question, because that's something Carlo D'Este talks about with the stolen road thing, and that's from earlier than Asaro and Ajira. Yeah. But nevertheless, it's interesting because there's a lot of criticism. It would have been better to give the Americans the road because they had the better motor transport. But I'm not so sure how well that motor transport and that mobility would have really helped them, because the Canadians are constantly up against German rear guards and things. And, they've been training with, they've been especially training with like battle drill to practice fire and movement tactics in the UK. And in a lot of ways, that's really helpful in these, hilltop battles where you kind of have to outflank the enemy and, around Valguanera and that sort of thing. So I don't really think they would have done much better. And to be honest, like the Canadians did very, very well at Valguanera, at Leonforte and Asoro, especially Asoro. Asoro is kind of the big, oh my God, what the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment did there. Yeah. It's incredible.
It's insane, yeah.
Their field craft was very heavily or highly rated by the Germans, who actually said that the field craft of the Canadians was better than our own troops. And so I think in this sort of terrain, and in that broken terrain, the Canadians did very well. And, I saw the comments about Troina and everything. Yeah, the 1st U.S. Division had some trouble there as well. Mobility doesn't necessarily help, and the 1st Division was combat experienced, unlike the Canadians' only combat experience came from earlier in this campaign. So, the Canadians and the 1st Division of the U.S., I think they actually packed a good 1-2 punch, because one of the things that's kind of going on here is you're really trying, just like always, you're trying to get the enemy to move, right? You're trying to get, the Germans and the Italians. The Italians are supporting kind of all of these operations, filling in gaps in the line, providing artillery, that sort of thing. We can't forget the Italians don't just go away after the first couple of days in Sicily. The Italians allow the Germans to kind of hold out as long as they do in Sicily because of the extra manpower that they provide. But basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to kind of destroy the enemy to the point where they just can't resist you any longer, and you can kind of jump past them. Now, it's pretty hard to jump past them in terrain like this where they can block it. Sicily is a place where, you've got a couple of roads that go through towns, and all you got to do is collapse a couple of buildings on one side of the street and a couple of buildings on the other, and you've got a roadblock that there's really no way around, because there's only maybe 2 routes through the town, and they're choke points, right?
Well, and you can see that here in the map, right? Just if you can see the terrain getting where it gets darker, right, it gets higher. Yeah. So it just makes it so difficult. And that's the axis of advance, right, that you're talking about. So it makes so difficult to doesn't, like you said already, if you have the motor transport, great. But if you can't get through a roadblock or you can't go around it, what good does it do? It certainly doesn't add to speed by any means.
Well, follow-up question from the Great Dominion. I suspect the Americans probably wouldn't have, because they just didn't have. And I probably don't know enough about the American training and experience in North Africa, but I don't think they were thinking in that mindset, right? They, the Canadians were thinking in that mindset because of their experience, with battle drill. And it's very much like the Canadians aren't able to train as well as you would ideally like in certain terms of a combined arms environment, right? With the artillery supporting them, with the Air Force supporting them, et cetera. Yeah. And so what they did focus on and what they were very good at was infantry tactics. And so, that's where they were able to, they were able to make some pretty impressive gains. Now, shortly past Osoro, those things aren't going to happen anymore because the Germans are kind of going to smarten up a little bit, and they want to hold those positions. So it's a bit of a stickier wicket to deal with for sure.
But yeah, so here's this photo. Have you seen that? So again, we're just talking about terrain. That's why I included this one originally because Alex, for everyone watching, Alex sent me an amazing amount of photos. So I just kind of, watching the hockey disappointment the other night, was going through them and, kind of picking out what I thought would, represent this campaign, but also kind of some things I knew Alex was going to want to talk about and things I like to talk about, especially with Sicily. But again, like we already talked about the conditions, the hot conditions, and that it's an infantry battle in a lot of ways. Obviously, like you said, it's combined arms. No, I'm not trying to downplay any other service, and we're going to talk about that towards the end. But it's indicative of what it was like,
But the hasty peas at Osoro could not have done what they did without the artillery, right? The artillery both fired in support of them directly to prevent, the German counterattacks from really harming them. And two, they fired distraction and other tasks to keep the Germans looking in the other direction. Mm-hmm. And really, the tricky thing about, and I'll say one little quick thing about air support and the air support in this campaign, we're not, calling them up on the radio and telling them to come in and hit a target that the infantry are really seeing. That doesn't happen very often in Sicily. The air support is kind of going to be mostly pre-planned stuff. And it's going to be stuff where the Air Force is the artillery is kind of one layer, and the Air Force is the second layer that's going out further. Basically, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to get the Germans to respond, right? You're trying to get out of their trenches, to get out of their dugouts, to get out from underneath like the olive fields or whatever where they've camouflaged everything, and to move forces around to meet your attack, right? And this is what happens constantly between the Agira and Troina battles in particular, is the Germans are constantly shifting forces kind of from one or the other. And actually it's more Regobuto as well later on, even after Agira with Troina. They're trying to shift forces around to prevent the Canadians or the Americans from breaking through. And what ends up happening is the Germans are trying to move around at night as much as they can because the Allies have complete air superiority. Right. What you do is if you can attack and if you can make a breach or if you can, force the enemy to have to reinforce, then the Air Force, which is roving in the background, can go and shoot up those troops as they're on their way, as the supplies are on their way, to the front. And that's kind of the 1, 2, 3 punch, if you will, that's going on in this battle space.
Yeah. So I was just wondering, because I think it's always been an interesting part of this campaign. I mean, I've only done a little bit. I did help with the Project 44th part where there's like the narrative parts. I helped with that. That came out today. I can put a link to that in the description below. But to me, the way I was reading things, I didn't use too many sources because I ran out of time. I got other things going on, as I always do. But it was the idea of like, yeah, we're facing resistance, but it's not much. It's not their toughest that we've seen until we get here. And I was wondering if like you could speak to that at all.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, at a certain point in the campaign, the kind of end runs, infantry tactics that are focused aren't really going to cut it as much anymore, because you've got Germans that really want to fight and stay. I mean, they kind of are planning. They're creating a plan to evacuate the island at some point. They know that's going to happen, but the troops in the line are told you need to hold out for as long as possible because. And this has strategic implications because the longer the Germans can keep the Allies from capturing Sicily, the longer they keep them from going into mainland Italy, the longer that they can keep maybe not Mussolini in power anymore because he is deposed on the 25th of July, right in the middle of this battle. But they can at least keep the Italians from defecting, essentially, because they know that's going to happen at some point. Mm-hmm. And so there's strategic implications here, right? We need to punch through. And, part of the issue is, the Canadians and the 1st U.S. Division are fighting here in the middle of the island. And the buildup is still occurring on the Allied side for what's going to be called Operation Hardgate, which starts kind of on the 30th of July. And that's where they bring in, reinforcements from North Africa. They were only ever supposed to have their full supplies and everything arriving 2 weeks after, D-Day and the ports were captured and stuff. So we're talking around this time where the Allies are really starting to build up their forces. And until then, the Canadians and the Americans on their left kind of need to keep attacking. And there's others, there's British forces. There's on the right-hand side of the screen there with the map, you'll see the 231st Brigade, which is the Malta Brigade, which is the brigade that's been garrisoning Malta for a number of years. They're actually attached to the Canadians for this operation. And, but the Germans want to stand, and the Italian forces that are with them are going to stand with them. And there's a series of defensive lines that the Canadians have to, circumvent here. The Royal Canadian Regiment gets a real bloody nose in their first attempt to get through here. Basically, 1st Brigade gets a bloody nose in their first attempt. And that's the one I was talking about, where with Simmons and the inflexible artillery plan and that sort of thing. But then after that, 2nd Brigade takes over. The Seaforth Highlanders in particular take the lead.
In the center here.
Some pretty heavy fighting, along this road. To get towards Ajira and to eventually, get into that town, which it's an interesting kind of story there, where they're about to kind of bombard it and kind of wipe it off the face of the earth. And I think it's the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry that sent a patrol in and realized the Germans are gone, and they call off bombardment because the Germans have kind of retreated to their next their next position.
Yeah, the next position. Because I read the war diaries quite extensively, right, for the stuff I did, and it's just, again, that's only the one person's perspective or the group of people, whoever, how each unit does their war diary, but it's just this almost sense of relief, right, that the thing Agira is going to be, I don't know what, like Ortona turns out to be, maybe. They don't know. They haven't really dealt with that yet, but the sense of relief, like, we didn't have to flatten this place, we didn't have to fight building to building, and the civilians, right, they do. It doesn't come up as much as it probably should, but they are at certain points, worried about the civilians. And to me, that came across, but maybe that was my own reading into it too much. But for Agira, it seems to come up a little bit, maybe because it's the first line of resistance, major resistance. I don't know.
It's interesting. I don't know what they felt about the civilians. And we can talk about that a bit, perhaps towards the end, because I've got some statistics I can share about that. But there's plenty of civilians that are killed. And actually, around this time, so the frustrating thing that the Allies are coming up against again is the Germans. They have the ground, they have the ability to block it whenever they want with mines, with IEDs, explosive devices, toppling a couple of buildings to create a rubble bottleneck, that sort of thing. And the Allies are definitely frustrated by this. And I have to say, one of the underrated or just underappreciated parts of this campaign is also the work of the engineers. That's actually one of the things I thought was pretty cool about Project 44, that they have their map, and they haven't quite mapped everybody in Sicily yet, but they have mapped some of the engineering units of the First Division. And it's really interesting to go through their war diaries and see what they're up to, because they're disarming mines, they're clearing rubble. Some of the detachments are building signs for these switchback mountain roads, so that drivers of supply trucks and stuff don't drive off a cliff. This is the sort of thing the engineers are doing to support this effort, and the same with the service corps and the truck drivers. And again, they had limited numbers of vehicles early in the campaign for sure, but they have to work kind of overtime to make sure the guns are supplied with all the rounds they need. Some of the, you've got to deliver all that ammunition, from, essentially the beaches down by Pechino or maybe, in Augusta in the harbor there that's been captured, shortly after D-Day. And you got to bring that all up and use it, because at the end of the day, they're going to be, First Bailey Bridge erected under fire. I think that was at Leonforte, I think, and the storming of Leonforte, where the engineers were really important in actually getting aid to, I think it was the Loyal Edmonton Regiment that was cut off in Leonforte, and they had to speed in reinforcements to help them out. And they practically leveled the town of Leonforte in the process of that battle. So, just to talk about the civilian side for a brief moment, there's points where the Army commanders are actually asking the air forces to like almost wipe certain towns off the map in the course of this campaign, especially in the passes. Adrano later in the campaign and the passes around Mount Etna, because what they're trying to do is there's only so many bridges that go across rivers and stuff. There's only so many routes through these towns, and they're trying to kind of get ahead of the game and bomb these towns so that the Germans can't really pass through them very quickly and stuff like that, right? And I don't know how effective that is. I mean, it certainly kills some Germans here and then, for sure. It definitely makes the Allies' job a bit difficult when it gets there. But to be honest, it's going to be difficult no matter what, because the Germans are going to do it anyway. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's going to be done one way or the other, I suppose.
There's a lot of civilians, that are killed in these towns in the process of these bombardments, though.
So speaking of the towns.
Yeah, and I mean, this is actually probably one of the bigger towns, and it's not on kind of a mountain pass, because this is a tank of the A Squadron of the Ontario Regiment. Yeah. Kind of a little known fact, I mean, it's important to understand the Allied order of battle, or the Canadian order of battle. It includes, 1st Canadian Division and pretty much all of their attendant units. It also includes the 1st Canadian Army Tank Brigade at the time. But it includes mainly the Three Rivers Regiment. So the Three Rivers Regiment is the regiment that's with 1st Canadian Division throughout, they're their tank support throughout the entire battle in the campaign in Sicily. The Ontario Regiment and the Calgary Regiment of Dieppe fame, they actually land a few days, or maybe it's a couple of weeks later. And they're actually an Army Reserve. Yeah, but the Calgarys don't really see any action, but the Ontario Regiment is sent forward as tank support for British units that are fighting in the Catania area, and so that's what this photo is of. It's not Catania; it's one of the towns outside of Catania. But that's a Sherman tank of the Ontario Regiment moving through one of those towns, and you can see, a whole lot going on in this picture. You got Italian civilians, Sicilians on the side, and I mean, Sheldrake was talking about the abject poverty of certain civilians. This would be more of the this would probably be more of the well-to-do, in the Catania area, but certainly where the Canadians were doing the bulk of the fighting up in the hills of central Sicily, you've got a lot of Sicilian peasants and that sort of thing as well. Yeah.
And this is just a shot I thought was really interesting because it marks Agira, but it just kind of showing again very quickly and kind of generally what the conditions of the towns, I guess, that they're called. They're not very big places, but kind of what they look like. And I think it was just a really cool shot to kind of just show what it was like. Because again, I obviously the Italian mainland gets more attention because it's a longer campaign. And I can't stop. I keep coming back to that, especially because I've done some stuff looking at Ortona and that kind of thing. But just the buildings and the conditions, right? These deep, jagged valleys and all this stuff, and how they play into the, the mythology and kind of the ethos of these battles is just, to me, is fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in that photo, you've got Agira beyond that town. It's a cool photo because you can kind of see the different levels of the town as well. Yeah, it kind of goes up the hill that it's built on. Beyond the town, on the other kind of side of that rise, would be the Canadian War Cemetery at Agira, where almost 500 Canadians are commemorated. And it's a beautiful, beautiful cemetery. Doesn't look as nice in the summer because all the grass is dead and it's yellow. But if you go in kind of more of the temperate months and stuff, it's quite beautiful. It has the backdrop is Mount Etna, the volcano. I can't recommend enough visiting Sicily. Like I was there in 2013. I would love to go again. I mean, the people are great. The scenery is great. The Italian campaign is really cool because you have all these spots where you can literally, if you're on a battlefield tour, you can find there are places you can do an army group level stand where you're talking about the entire Allied force on the island because you just have the sight lines where you can see out into the distance on a clear day. So I can't recommend that enough.
Yeah, but I've heard some, again, like I said, like watching the travel shows, especially like talking to the people and everything, and I'm quite a big foodie, so I hear the food in Sicily is kind of off the charts, so that's a big plus.
Lots of seafood if you
exactly. Well, and I love seafood, so Yeah, so it's great, but it's an amazing place. I just wanted to visit, but yeah, I thought the show was cool. So let's keep moving forward here, because I do want to not talk about the Army too much longer, because I want to get to your
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating campaign. So this is, you have the capture of Regalbuto here. This is back with 1st Brigade again, and it's kind of a rotating basis, right? Different brigades brought into the line. You can see there's some British units, the 2nd Devons and the 1st Dorsets, kind of taking over, and we're getting at this point towards the towards the end of the campaign. At least for the Canadians, there's still a couple weeks left in the overall Battle of Sicily, but the Canadians are going to be rotated into the line shortly. There's another battle kind of to take Adrano with, I believe, I guess it's 2nd Brigade again, that takes over, that role there. Because Adrano is kind of a really important spot, because it's where the highway coming. So you have Mount Etna, and you have the highway coming down from the north side of Mount Etna, and then you have the highway linking Adrano kind of to the Catania Plain and the sea and everything. So if you can get there, it means the Germans have to fall back along both slopes of Mount Etna around it.
You can see here, just on the corner here, because there's Adriano and then Mount Etna, which is quite large. And then, the highway that skirts. Sorry, I can't talk after an hour. It skirts around the mountain, which is obviously very important to get to Messina. But I do want to just, because I do want to move forward, but I don't want to move past it without talking about it. The Asora and Leoforte, like you said, were the same sort of thing, difficult fighting. They dig in more or less to hold these valleys on these ones. This one's not as high as some of the other ones, but it's still a difficult thing to take.
If you go to Asoro, is just so impressive, and I wish I had a photo of the actual cliff that they went up, and it's you think about Vimy Ridge and you think about this huge thing, and it's really not all that impressive when you go there. I mean, it's still a very important feature. This is an impressive, like, oh my gosh, how the heck did they do this? Trying to scale this thing and then get in behind the Germans. So that's a really great place to just visit and see. I think there's now an artillery memorial at the top of that that spot as well. I think there was some issues.
Right,
Maybe the plaque might have gotten stolen or something. But they fixed that, and so it's a really great spot to go. And there's very the benefit the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment have is they had Farley Mowat as their regimental historian, and obviously he spins a good yarn. And that is kind of one of the outstanding Canadian actions. Leonforte as well, for sure. It just doesn't get as much press because it's not Farley Mowat, but these two actions are some of the most impressive Canadian actions of the Second World War.
I mean, it's just I didn't even think of that because I've been trying to do too much. But I should have taken. I've seen a picture. I think is when I was doing some stuff with Project 44, which I think they have something on Asoro. I'm not entirely sure, but there might be with the new package that got released. I didn't really get a chance to look at it yet, but because I worked with Nathan and saw something, it is almost like the cliff is just and here's about the memorial, but the cliff itself is just so striking to see even a photo. I can only imagine what it's like on the ground. But anyway, we should I think if I find it later, I'll put it down below for anyone who's watching this later. But the Asoro story, if you can read it and anything, just read it. It's amazing. I don't think me and Alex can do justice talking here with each other about it.
That's a good one. That's a good comment, Shal Drake. I guess Farley Mowat got his revenge with getting Asoro kind of the top of our if all the medals went to the folks who fought at Leonforte.
Leonforte. But that's something else we don't really have time to talk about today. But this the whole. I mean, because I saw the war diaries again when I was helping Project 44 because they're digitizing them for finding them because we were just like, obviously Farley Mowat we know, but we did real quick check and it's like this is him. He's writing this stuff, so he wrote like the war diary. So it's just it's really. Yeah. So anyway, we should move on. So I do want to talk about this because you said you had some insights here for us.
Yeah. So like I said before, mainly after the Canadians, like capturing Adrano is part of Operation Hardgate, and once the Canadians do that, assist with that activity, they're kind of out of the line. But Operation Hardgate continues forward, and it's a British offensive, but there's also Americans involved. the 9th U.S. Division takes over for the 1st U.S. Division and keeps punching to the north of Mount Etna. The British are punching around kind of the south and eastern face of it. And the Germans are just constantly, the geography is very much in the German and Italian favor, because at the, Sicily ends in this point here. And so as you have this big, volcano, and you only have to defend so many parts of the line around that volcano. And as you continuously retreat, your lines can get shorter, which means that you can take people out of the line. They can be sent to mainland Italy, and you can still kind of hold your line. So, there's a whole bunch of questions about whether or not the Allies should have been able to stop, especially the German evacuation. There was an Italian evacuation going on as well. The air forces were never able to completely interdict the Messina Strait. They certainly did a lot of damage to the port infrastructure, to the railway systems. They prevented the most efficient means of transport from being used, like, the big, many of the big railway ferries that the Italians operated in peacetime, weren't really available. Some of them still were, but a lot of them had been hit and were being repaired and had been sunk. But the Germans do have one really important asset, two really important assets. One is they have a heck of a lot of anti-aircraft artillery. And I'm just going to bring up some numbers on a different slide deck so I don't get this wrong. I won't share the slide, but I just want to make sure. So there are almost 400 AA guns of various calibers in this sector. 239 of those are based on land on either side of the strait, and 151 are aboard the evacuation vessels that the Germans have. And so that's all German. I'm pretty sure that's mainly German guns, but there might be some Italian guns mixed in there as well. And so they've got this, they're able to put up a significant flak barrage around the area. And in a sense, they're able to contest Allied air superiority in this particular region for a certain period of time. The Allies, and in doing so, the other asset that the Germans have is they have a really good, they don't have a big navy or anything like that, but they do have a good amount of ferry type vessels and barges and things like that, landing craft, I should say, that they were using during the North African campaign and escaped to southern Italy after that. And so they were able to put those two pieces in place to make this evacuation possible. The Allied air forces never actually, they had kind of a plan to launch kind of an all-out offensive against this spot. They never really did, because especially the heavy bombers were never really called in.
Right.
But interestingly enough, what actually kind of happened is, and we'll talk about the Canadians in a second, but the best success was had by British night bombers, medium bombers like Wellington bombers that actually bombed kind of the beaches. A lot of the heavy bombers were focused on kind of the ports and stuff when they attacked. And the thing is the Germans aren't really using the ports. They're using open beaches to get these escape troops away for the most part.
Right.
And so, but the medium bombers at night are attacking these spots. And the Germans actually realize that they actually have to stop evacuating at night and start evacuating during the day. But they're only able to do that because they have that anti-aircraft capability. And it's interesting because if you look at the numbers, and they're in my book, the Allies achieve almost no success at attacking, fighter bombers and light bombers attacking German and Italian vessels in the Straits. But when the Germans or the Italian, when these these vessels venture outside the Straits, they just get pounded. Some of the figures, the tactical air force claimed in this period 23 vessels destroyed, 43 direct hits, and 201 near misses. The German ferry vessel losses actually stack up really well. One account has 25, and one account has 23 lost. So in terms of actually destroyed, the Allies are on some they're actually quite close to what the reality is. And that doesn't really include the Italian stuff as well. What's interesting is there's so many direct hits and near misses, and a lot of that is because of the anti-aircraft fire. The pilots are just not, and it's, again, nothing's very accurate. You're attacking with a 500-pound bomb and you're diving down, and these are not, they don't even, they're using, Kitty Hawks and P-40 Tomahawks in terms of the Americans. The Americans also have A-36 dive bombers, which are basically an early version of the P-51 Mustang, but it's used as a fighter bomber. And it was one of the most heavily defended places in Europe, and these results just speak to that. The Allied air forces in the day just weren't able to get in here. And when they did hurt the enemy, they hurt them because they went outside of the flak cone, essentially. The Navy, at night, the Royal Navy sent in, mortar torpedo boats and stuff to try to mess with things, but they didn't really want to get involved in this area during the day. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is this is a fairly heavily fortified area from a naval perspective, because there are basically naval fortresses in this area that the Italians have maintained for years and years. And in the Italian fleet, while the Italians are close to surrendering, the Italian fleet is still a threat. Mm-hmm. And this is a very narrow passage. I remember we went swimming just south of Messina when we were there. The current is incredibly strong in this area. So navigation, in a running fight is not an easy thing to do. So the Navy didn't really want any part of this. And really the Air Force kind of said, well, we can do what we can, but really, unless you can give us a physical barrier, i.e. park the Navy in the strait and just blow the crap out of everything that moves, there's very little, that they can do. And so that's my kind of more nuanced take on this. That, most historians you'll read, Carlo d'Este, for instance, Mitcham von Stauffenberg, will suggest that, it's a big, huge, failure that the Allies, it's a bitter victory. It's a Pyrrhic victory because the Allies took Sicily, but they didn't stop the enemy from escaping. Yeah. Well, the enemy that did escape were, their combat formations were heavily depleted. They evacuated a heck of a lot of wounded casualties. They got the army away, but it was heavily, it was badly mauled. Yes. In the process. And the Air Force and the Canadian Army, they played a significant role in that. And it's something that I think we need to talk about a bit more. The other thing is there is a propaganda angle here from the German perspective. You got to think about what's going on in August 1943. Well, a couple of weeks before, Hamburg has just been pummeled. Battle on the Eastern Front has not gone well. The Germans need some sort of victory right now. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that they do, and again, it's spun around a little kernel of truth, which is they got away, but they got away in the face of huge opposition. They were outnumbered, 8 or 10 to 1, and they killed way more troops than they lost themselves. And there's a little bit of a German propaganda coup in that for many decades after the war, the literature kind of, toted the same line as what, Goebbels would have toted, during the war of, we got away scot-free and it was a good, battle for us. But in reality, it puts the Germans in a very bad strategic situation. By this time, you had 4 German divisions in Sicily. Well, guess what? They're going to be joined by at least another 10 in Italy that are already preparing to take over, the country. Those are divisions that a lot of them were resting and getting ready to go back to the Eastern Front or to be used for, to oppose an Allied landing in France. And now instead they're going to be in Italy, and the Italians are going to fight them there. And, we should probably move to the Air Force slides here, but that's I always like to leave people with.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't want to get into too much, but again, and this comes up in numerous other areas of the Canadian War experience and the Allied War experience, is this sort of German influence from that propaganda angle that still sticks around. So I don't want to get upset about that again, but so we'll move on because I do want to talk about the Air Force. So this is just the end here.
The Air Force is it's something we don't talk about in Canada enough when it comes to supporting operations like Husky. And Husky is very interesting because, one, it's actually probably the greatest air battle of the Mediterranean War. And that's not me. That's Williamson Murray, quite a well-known American historian who studied the Luftwaffe, who said that. And the reason he said that is because the amount of German aircraft lost in July 1943 in the Mediterranean, quite significantly, it was the highest amount of losses in the Mediterranean throughout the entire war for the Luftwaffe. But not only that, those losses in July 1943 were even higher than the losses in the entire Eastern Front during the same month, during the Battle of Kursk, which is this massive battle that everybody talks about, right?
Yeah,
and
huge.
Because the Germans had sent, again, like I said off the top, they had sent something like 40% of their single-engine fighter production south in the spring, because they knew they couldn't send the army fast enough, but what they could send pretty quickly was the Air Force. And so they send in all these aircraft, all these pilots, and they are just, unlike where the Germans have all the advantages over Northwest Europe, right, on the air offensive, right? Because it's just like the opposite of the Battle of Britain. The Americans are, we don't have P-51 Mustangs yet to do long-range escort, and so the Americans are getting mauled in some cases in 1943. There's raids that are going on at this time where they lose like 60 aircraft, 60 B-17s in one operation.
Right.
And in Sicily and in the Mediterranean, you have, they may not have lost 60 B-17s in the entire campaign, and there's, a significant amount of aircraft involved on both sides. You've got, this is bigger than the Battle of Britain. For instance, the Allied order of battle, you've got about, 3,600 aircraft. Nothing compared to what they had on D-Day, but still, fairly substantial. The Germans and Italians together have, something like just under half of that, 45% of that, but their serviceability numbers aren't nearly as good. And so the air battle is a really important component that doesn't really get talked about enough. And there's a lot of people who complain, a lot of people on the spot who complain. If you watch the movie Patton, I just rewatched Sicily the other day, they're always complaining about air support, the lack of air support.
We need more air support.
And yeah, sure, they haven't developed the air support systems entirely that they're going to, maybe quote unquote perfect in Normandy.
Right.
But at the same time, the Air Force is doing a whole lot of really important things. And yes, they're getting attacked by the German Air Force because the German Air Force is still active. The Italian Air Force is still active. But in the large scheme of things, those operations are taking a huge toll on the enemy air forces. And the Italians lose a whole bunch of their best aces of the war during the Battle of Sicily. They're almost a spent force by this point. And again, the Germans just take a huge shellacking. If you go to the next one, talk about the Canadian effort. So the Canadians.
Sorry, I just want to stop you there, Alex, for a quick second, because I don't know if you're going to bring it up. But on that previous slide was Alex's book. There's a link down below for anyone watching now or later to purchase it. I highly suggest you do it, not just because it helps me, but because it's great. And just like, and I'll say this so Alex doesn't have to. It is an important part that is not not talked about, and I think that's a mistake. And that's, I think, a common thread of my channel is talking about things that are not talked about enough or talked about properly. I love saying I like to bust myths, and this is one of them. So I really want to get this out there. This is like, the fellow traveler for me doing the Hong Kong stuff. Like, let's focus on something that doesn't get focused on a little bit. But anyway, sorry, I just wanted to get that out there before I forgot.
Appreciate that. So we always talk about, 562 Canadians were killed in Sicily, right?
Yeah.
Yes, 562 Canadian soldiers were killed in Sicily. No, very few people realize that 150 or so Canadian airmen were also killed during the course of this campaign in various activities relating to the campaign. So, for instance, and these numbers, by the way, again, the Canadian Army's effort in Sicily is essentially from the 10th of July 1943 to, I don't know if it's the 12th of August when the Ontario Regiment stops fighting. The air forces are operating on or around Sicily, doing shaping operations, whatever, ever since the end of North Africa in mid-May of 1943. So these figures, the 150 or so, is from the period of the end, like mid-May 1943 to August 17th, 1943. But most of those occur in kind of June, July in particular.
Right.
And 90 or so of them are from the 331 wing, RCAF. Very few people know about 331 wing RCAF, but it was a wing of Wellington bombers, which were seconded from Bomber Command. This is in the kind of spring 1943, the British realized they need a few extra night bomber squadrons for this operation. And so they sent out a call and they asked the Canadians to send the squadrons. And the Canadians, they're willing to do it, but it's a tough time for them to do it because 6th Group, which is the Canadian group in Bomber Command, has just stood up at the start of 1943. And suddenly they're taking away a significant chunk of their strength as they build. But for 6 months, these 3 squadrons, number 420 Squadron, 424 Squadron, and 425 Squadron, they go to Tunisia and they bomb targets in Sicily, in Sardinia, in Italy, in support of this and other operations on the mainland of Italy until about November of 1943. And we don't talk about them very much, but it would be like talking about Operation Husky and not talking about the role of the Three Rivers Regiment or something like that. Like a wing is essentially like worth a brigade, if you will, right? And you've got a wing of of airmen, supporting this operation. You've also got number 417 Squadron. Absolutely, Sheldrake. And again, shaping operations there's actually a guy, I should tell you, can't remember his name at this very moment, but there's a guy who was serving with the RAF. He flew Kitty Hawks. He was in a fighter bomber squadron, shot down over Sicily. They don't really know what happened to him. He's actually commemorated on the El Alamein Memorial, of all things, and not Malta for some reason. I guess because he wasn't flying out of Malta, he was flying out of Sicily by then. And so it's really weird, but across the Mediterranean, these people are commemorated, and that's an important thing to consider as well. You've got these 4 squadrons, 417, the Spitfire Squadron, which we have some photos of in a second. Yeah. But about 60% of Allied airmen who were killed and who served in the Mediterranean or in the Air Force during the war, who were killed, I should rephrase that, who were killed during Operation Husky in the Air Force during the war, or who served in the Air Force during the war, as opposed to killed throughout the war, were serving in RAF or Commonwealth units. And so you had Canadians scattered all across the Mediterranean, playing a whole bunch of different roles in support of this operation.
Yeah, and I think this is a bit of an aside, but I think I had a discussion where someone else started on Twitter, I can't remember, 2 weeks ago or so, about the Canadians being spread across the RAF and kind of how you would even go about, writing a book about that. Yeah, but that's just an interesting aside. Something to remember is that there's Canadians in other units, especially in the Air Force, and even in the Royal Navy too, which I think is interesting. That doesn't get talked about. Anyway, that's an aside. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but I just did want to put that out there that I think it's just interesting. We should talk about it, but yeah. And I do want to give a shout out to the Alouette Squadron. I can't not with my fellow French Canadians.
We've got a couple of photos. We've got a photo of them as well. If you wanted to get into the Air Force photos here. So this is one of my favorites. Beautiful photograph taken by an official British Royal Air Force photographer of AN. AN is the designation for 417 Squadron. So this is City of Windsor Squadron in Tunisia. Beautiful original color photograph, not colorized, original color photograph. A couple more photos of the squadron in Sicily on our list here, if we keep going.
Sorry,
not at all.
There we go.
So this one, you can see they've got, this is in a blast pen. So they've got the Spitfire parked in a blast pen. And, the German Air Force is still active, especially at night. They can come over and make a mess of your day. But this is at Cassibile in southeastern Sicily. And interesting little story. 417 Squadron didn't do a lot during Operation Husky. I was very surprised that they didn't have a lot to do. They were kind of as part of a wing with 3 or 4 other squadrons, and they were in reserve. So they were given kind of a not too active tasks. They certainly went on patrols and things, but they didn't see too many enemy aircraft. They did lose 1 pilot and 1 aircraft actually over the Straits of Messina. He was bounced by an Italian fighter. But interestingly enough, one of their kind of, I guess, claims to fame that nobody knows about is they actually helped when the Italian armistice was being signed or negotiated, I should say, in kind of late August 1943 in Cassibile. They weren't based at Cassibile anymore, but anyway, it was being signed and negotiated in that area. 417 Squadron actually provided escort for General Eisenhower's aircraft on at least one occasion, so to make sure that it was safe coming into that spot. got a couple more photos of the squadron. They then moved. They moved from Malta to here, and then they moved to Lentini West, which is actually quite close to where the 1st Canadian Army Tank Brigade was kind of based for a lot of the campaign.
Right.
And they were there first, so they actually got their choice of headquarters, and they took the farm building here, the farmhouse in the background.
Yeah.
And so you can really see the chin scoop in this one really well. That's used to help with the it's a dust filter, essentially developed for North Africa, but also there's a lot of dust in the sunny and hot weather in Sicily, so they're still using them here. You've got you can see kind of if you zoomed in a little bit on that guy on the just on the wing, he's actually painting
There he is.
aircraft. And if you go, once you zoom in here, you can see him there. You can go to the next slide, the next photo I sent you, and you'll get a I believe it's the same aircraft, a close-up shot. I'm pretty sure the guy with the pith helmet on the left is the same guy. He's the artist. He's Corporal John Olson, whose branding is, he used to work for Sunoco. So he was an ERC. He was a guy, refueling, rearming the aircraft. That was his job. And he worked for Sunoco before the war. So presumably he had, some experience perhaps with fuel and oil and that sort of thing. And then the pilot officer Stewart is sitting in the aircraft there. You can recognize that he's an officer by his cap. And then you also have Sergeant Leclerc popping over the fuselage there as well. So that's a lovely photograph, probably almost of the same. I feel like it might even be a photograph of the same spot almost. Maybe the Spitfire's been moved slightly, but you can see kind of the tree there in the background, and there were some trees in the background of the other photo to the left of the farmhouse. So pretty neat photo there. A couple more photos, and then we'll wrap things up. Got some photos of more ERCs as well. So these are 331 wing ERCs. I don't remember which squadron they're from, but they're in Tunisia. You can see that they're wearing, you're used to seeing kind of a bit of a different uniform for the RAF in the UK and in Northwest Europe. They're wearing their kind of, long socks and shorts and khakis as opposed to blue uniforms or anything like that. The next photo is a gentleman that very few people know about.
Sorry, I want to cut you off because I messaged you the other night. I literally started digging.
Yeah.
And like, I should know who this is, and I don't. And it was driving me crazy. I could not find him, so I just gave up. And I'm like, Alex, tell me who he is.
This is at the time Group Captain Clarence R. Dunlap, and he commanded 331 Wing in North Africa in Tunisia when they were there for the 6 months. He actually was also a D-Day vet in the sense of, he commanded a wing of B-25s in the Tactical Air Force, I believe, for D-Day as well. He was kind of a medium bomber specialist, if you will. And he actually went on to become the chief of the air staff, the last chief of the air staff before unification happened in, I guess it was 1968. And so he quite important figure in the Cold War Air Force. Interestingly enough, his successor eventually, when Air Command was generated, when the Canadian Forces were a thing, was another Sicily veteran who was a photo reconnaissance pilot who actually passed away just a couple of years ago. And Bill Carr was his name. And he was a photo reconnaissance pilot based out of Malta. He was a flight, he might have been a flying officer. He eventually was a flight lieutenant, I think, by the end of the war. But he would eventually be, a lieutenant general and in charge of the Air Force after Dunlap. Dunlap is essentially the last of the air marshals.
How old is he? Yeah.
I actually don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to look up his age. But I think, he's fairly young, and he was pre-war Air Force, one of the kind of few officers in the Air Force prior to the war. I suspect he's probably in his late 30s, but I'd have to look that up. But certainly his career spanned another 20 years at least. 25 years really.
So yeah, that was a really besides my personal frustration, I just obviously started doing all the kind of digging I normally do when I try to generalize what I'm looking for, excuse me. But yeah, it was really interesting because I found some different resources and things I'd never seen before. So my goal with the show was to educate everybody, but sometimes I get lots of education. And this photo, while frustrating, taught me quite a bit about kind of the good stuff that's out there for Sicily.
So he was born in 1908.
Yeah.
So that would make him in 48. He would have been 40. So yeah, he's late 30s. He's young. A fairly young group captain, I guess, but at the same time, you had wing commanders who were like 25 or younger. Like Lloyd Chadwick was like, I don't know, like 23 when he died in 44. So he's only one rung up from there, technically. But yeah.
Still fairly young.
Well, you've got like a lieutenant colonel. I can't remember his name right now. I think it's like E.P. Thompson or something. Thompson, his last name maybe, who's a brigadier in the Scheldt. Like he wasn't even a brigadier. He was acting brigadier.
Yeah.
And he was like 23.
Yeah, something like that. It's crazy. Yeah. But anyway.
So this is Blues in the Night, which is a Wellington, a Vickers Wellington from Alouette Squadron, 425 Squadron. Blues in the Night. So that's the 5-man crew. So that's the full crew there. I'm not sure who's who. I don't have, unfortunately, their names on captions. But the blues, the musical notes, each one stands for an operation that they have completed. And they're actually recently, I guess, when this photo was taken, tour expired. They'd finished their tour. And that was one of the things, actually, that kind of was a bit of an issue in the Mediterranean. Tours were, 25 missions in Bomber Command. But in the Mediterranean, it wasn't as dangerous. And so you could do many more missions than the 25 you were, supposedly supposed to do. And I know the Americans had trouble with this because, you have your 30 mission. They make a big joke of this in Catch-22 if you've either watched the movie, read the book, or seen the TV series of how the mission caps keep getting moved up. And that did happen because, they just, 25 or 30 missions, it just wasn't enough. Because you would run through their air crew too quickly, and you'd end up, sending people home way too quickly, because the frequency of operations was very high as well. Because the weather is better in the Mediterranean too, and so you've got that to consider. One last photo, and we'll wrap up. You've got another, I believe, tour expired crew here. This is, I believe, not 100% sure on this, 424 City of Hamilton Squadron. Slow but Sure is their bomber. And you can see that they've kept their tally in a bit of a different fashion. And they've also, one of them at least, perhaps the pilot or the navigator, has received a Distinguished Flying Cross. And that's been added to the bomber art as well. I'm not really sure what the different colored bombs mean. I don't know if that's maybe some of them were over Europe and some of them were over Mediterranean or different types of missions. I don't know. But nevertheless, really neat bit of nose art there and to see the crew. And I just think I don't have a full picture of one here. The Wellington's just a really cool looking bomber, I think.
Yeah, it's a bit of a funky looking thing, but it is cool if you guys appreciate the bomber design and the changes. It's a cool one, but yeah, not my favorite, but I mean it's a cool one.
And very effective here, They were trying to be phased out of the a bomber command just because they didn't have the bomb load capacity, the range capacity of like a Lancaster or a Halifax or a Sterling, but still very useful night bombers in this instance. So, well, I mean, we've been going for almost an hour and a half. I didn't think I was going to go that long, but it's been a lot of fun. Lots of great questions from the audience. So thanks everybody for participating.
Yeah, thanks everybody for watching. So yeah, this was a great presentation. Alex obviously knows his Sicily stuff. There's lots there. A great campaign. And did you enjoy yourself on the show today, Alex?
Oh, I loved it. There's really good audience, like we said, and it's been a while. I haven't got a chance to talk about Sicily for some time. It's been I work for the Juno Beach Center Association, so I'm always talking about a different amphibious landing and campaign. But it's
the one that gets a little attention. We won't talk about that big one, but anyway, So thanks for coming on. I'll just come by to say bye to you in a second, but I just want to wrap up on my own here. So. Thanks everybody for watching. A great show. I'm doing presentation on something like Sicily, something I really like. Like I said, about halfway through, I like doing things that are not focused on as much. I like doing the big stuff, but I also like to do things that don't get as much attention. So Alex was great in that and knows his stuff, obviously. So maybe we can have him back on, talk about something else. He's pretty much got an open invitation to come on whenever he likes, but this was great. I'm not too sure what I have planned coming up because I have my dissertation defense coming. So that's a bit of big thing on my mind. So once that's done, hopefully I can get some more stuff out on social media about what I'll be doing next. I do have some stuff lined up, but I'm not sure when I'll get to it. Hopefully soon, because I got to finish up the dissertation and stuff like that. So thanks everybody for watching. Check out the links below, like I already said. Check out the book. It's a great one, covering the details we talked about today, but more, me and Alex were talking about it before, a bit more about the air campaign, but check it out. Thanks again to my patrons and everyone who's helped me out with buy me a coffee. Sorry about that. I got the new microphone going today, which I couldn't have done without all this help. It's been amazing getting this kind of support. And I think everybody, you can support me if you like. The links are down below. So thanks everyone. Do support me so I can keep doing this stuff. I really like doing it, and I want to keep going. So I need some help in that area. So if you could, that'd be great. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. So everyone have a good rest of your weekend and have a good day. See you, everybody.